A former U.S. Air Force fighter pilot named Gerald Eddie Brown, who flew under the call sign Runner, was arrested on Wednesday after spending the last 2 years in China, where he's alleged to have worked directly for the People's Liberation Army, sharing American secrets and training Chinese fighter pilots to fight his own former colleagues in the sky. Now, under the letter of the law, Brown's clandestine service for the Chinese military constitutes a direct violation of the Arms Export Control Act, and if war were to break out between the US and China anytime soon, this alleged betrayal of his oath might even constitute treason. Now, Brown's 24 years in the U.S. Air Force saw him train pilots to fly everything from the F-4 Phantom II to the F-15 Eagle to the F-16 Fighting Falcon and the A-10 Thunderbolt II. He commanded units tasked with delivering nuclear weapons, and after leaving active duty, he served as a contracted simulator instructor for current A-10 and F-35 pilots. Of course, even those alleged to have betrayed the United States still deserve the same rights and protections provided by the Constitution and the legal framework of the nation. And it's important that we maintain the same respectful skepticism of the charges filed against Brown as we do of his defense. So, let's go over what we know about these charges, the evidence to substantiate them, and if they're true, just how dire the risk Brown has created for his former teammates, friends, subordinates, and aviators in the U.S. Air Force and beyond. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Oh, hey, wait, no ad to skip today. Just me asking you to click subscribe down below. It's not a big deal for you, but it has a huge impact on my end, and it allows me to keep doing the type of work that I love to do. So if you could be so kind as to click that button, I will do my best to make it worth your while. And as always, I appreciate you being here. Thanks. On Wednesday, former U.S. Air Force Major Gerald Runner Brown Jr. was arrested in Jefferson, Indiana, and charged with, quote, providing and conspiring to provide defense services to Chinese military pilots without authorization, in violation of the Arms Export Control Act, or AECA. Now, according to the indictment, Brown's Air Force career spanned 24 years and included commanding units tasked with delivering nuclear weapons, leading operational combat sorties, and even becoming a pilot instructor for just about every major tactical aircraft operated by the Air Force in the latter half of the Cold War, again, including the F-4, the F-15, the F-16, and the A-10. He later became a simulator instructor for the F-35. Then, around August of 2023, an intermediary put Brown into contact with someone who just might be familiar to you if you've watched this channel for a while. A man who goes by the name Stephen Sue Bin. And those with a good memory will recall that Sue Bin was convicted of stealing hundreds of thousands of files from American defense contractors pertaining to aircraft like the C-17 Globemaster III, the F-22 Raptor, and the F-35 Lightning II back in 2014. Bin's emails with his Chinese handlers at the time made it clear that his goal was to steal technology related to advanced American aircraft to, quote, stand easily on the giant's shoulders. Now, Sue Bin was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison, and upon his release, seems to have gotten right back to work, recruiting assets within the American defense apparatus for further intelligence gathering. Now, in communications between Brown, Sue Bin, and at least one other unnamed co-conspirator, Brown is said to have repeatedly stated his intent to train Chinese pilots in combat operations, where he voiced his excitement over having the chance to, quote, fly and instruct fighter pilots again. Now, that unnamed co-conspirator told Brown that he hoped the American would be assigned to his base, but otherwise he'd be assigned to what was described as the, quote, Chinese equivalent of Air Force Weapons School, which, for those who aren't familiar, could be seen as roughly analogous to the Navy's famous Top Gun, more formally known as the U.S. Navy Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program. Now, that's all to say that Brown would be directly training elite Chinese fighter pilots on American air-to-air tactics. In December of 2023, after roughly 4 months of negotiating his contract, Brown left the United States for China, where he's alleged to have spent the following 2 years working directly with the People's Liberation Army Air Force, doing, well, exactly that, before returning to the United States in February of this year, leading to his arrest. I'll quote the Assistant Director of the FBI's Counterintelligence and Espionage Division, Roman Rozovsky, now, quote, Gerald Brown, a former F-35 Lightning II instructor pilot with decades of experience flying U.S. military aircraft, allegedly betrayed his country by training Chinese pilots to fight against those he swore to protect. Now, the indictment states that Brown left active duty in 1996, which suggests to me that he spent at least a fair portion of his 24 years in a reserve capacity, simply because of how those dates line up. Brown, who's 65 today, would have been 35 in 1996, and if that were the end of a 24-year career, he would have had to commission into the Air Force at just 11 years old. Instead, it's a lot more likely that Brown was commissioned as a second lieutenant at age 21 or 22 in the early 1980s and started flying the F-4, then left active duty to transition to the reserves in 1996 after 14 or 15 years in active service. Brown likely maintained that reserve status for the subsequent decade, but probably didn't spend enough time on active duty orders or attending drills to earn enough points toward a formal retirement, which is why the Justice Department would call him a former fighter pilot rather than a retired one. Now, upon his separation, Brown first found work as a commercial cargo aircraft pilot before more recently accepting a role as a contracted simulator instructor for A-10 and, maybe most concerningly, F-35 pilots. And therein lies another important distinction for us to make, because despite being characterized as an F-35 pilot in both Justice Department press releases and in major news media, I haven't found any evidence of Brown ever actually logging any flight hours in the platform. That's to say that while Brown did work as a simulator instructor for America's most advanced fighter, at least in service today, his real-world experience with the F-35 seems to be rather limited. But it's also important to note that there's a fair bit of variety in the types of simulators employed by the U.S. Air Force, ranging from desktop setups not all that dissimilar from a home gaming rig to massive integrated virtual environments meant to simulate nearly every aspect of real-life flying. Now, some of these simulators are so classified that outsiders aren't even allowed to take pictures of them. And I say that from personal experience, having toured Lockheed Martin's training, logistics, and simulation site in Orlando, Florida, where I was only allowed to film or take pictures in one empty room of their sprawling facility, and I even had a personal escort for bathroom breaks. Now, without knowing what type of simulator Brown was contracted to work on, it is really hard to say exactly how deep his knowledge of the F-35 may go. But as a respected former pilot instructor, it isn't crazy to think that he may have had much deeper access to the fighter's at least simulated capabilities than Uncle Sam would probably prefer. But with no seat time in the aircraft itself, it does seem likely that Brown's instructing on the F-35 also could have been limited to simple tasks like takeoff, landing, flying on instruments, and other basics. Now, the technical implications of Brown's alleged betrayal are, to be honest, pretty tough to nail down. Despite his extensive experience in still operational platforms, namely the F-15, F-16, and A-10, these aircraft have seen pretty significant upgrades and changes since his departure from active service all the way back in 1996. The F-15, F-15E, and F-16 fleets have all undergone radar modernization programs since then, replacing their legacy pulse Doppler radar arrays with much more powerful and sophisticated active electronically scanned arrays. Likewise, the Air Force's F-16s underwent the Common Configuration Implementation Program starting in 2002, which was described at the time as, quote, the most extensive retrofit of the F-16 and involves major changes to the aircraft avionics and cockpit. It wasn't until 2003 that both F-15 and F-16 fleets started seeing the integration of the Joint Helmet-Mounted Cueing System, or JHMCS, the system you use to target other aircraft with your line of sight. And while some F-15s did have Joint Tactical Information Distribution System terminals installed prior to Brown's departure, That capability wouldn't mature into the Link 16 multifunctional information distribution system that we know today until later in the decade, and wouldn't become prevalent in F-15Es or F-16s until the early to mid-2000s. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known as the Warthog, also saw pretty significant changes after Brown's time, with the precision engagement modification beginning in 2005 that allowed for the integration of precision-guided munitions and the requisite targeting pods you'd need to employ them effectively. And of course, this is anything but an exhaustive list. All of these platforms have seen consistent updates and upgrades and improvements over the years, with today's most modern iterations of each pretty universally considered to be a lot more capable today than they were during Brown's uniformed tenure. And the same could be said for the weapon systems that these aircraft employ. The revolutionary JDAM, or Joint Direct Attack Munition, that turned old-fashioned gravity bombs into GPS-guided pinpoint killers, didn't reach initial operating service until 2 years after Brown dropped his uniform, let alone the long list of modern munitions that entered service since then. And then, of course, there's advanced electronic warfare systems like the F-15E and F-15EX's Eagle Passive Active Warning and Survivability System, and the F-16's AN/ALQ-257 Integrated Viper Electronic Warfare Suite, both of which only started to come online in 2025. But then there's tacit combat knowledge, or experiential expertise derived from more than 2 decades in the cockpit, and that, to be honest, could be the real problem. Even if Brown never shared a single classified detail with the Chinese military, providing advanced pilot training is in itself a direct form of capability transfer. Showing Chinese fighter pilots how Americans think about the fight, how they plan their operations, how they brief those plans to others, and then how they execute them, all offers the People's Liberation Army Air Force 2 distinct avenues to benefit from Brown's experience. The first is the most direct, with Brown's teachings making Chinese fighter pilots more proficient than they otherwise could be, pulling from internal sources alone. The second, of course, is how that newfound understanding of American tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, could be used to interfere with or mitigate the efforts of American forces in an actual fight. Brown's experience with things like how fighters integrate with airborne warning and control aircraft, how they go about meeting up with tankers near contested airspace, even simple formation logic that could be gleaned from publicly available texts, all become a lot more valuable to the Chinese military when they're shared through the cooperative scope of a seasoned American veteran who's been employing them for decades. In practice, these 2 avenues of approach for the Chinese military could allow for more competent and capable Chinese fighter pilots, as well as much more realistic oppositional force, or OPFOR training. Or in other words, Brown's teachings about how U.S. fighters operate could allow Chinese aggressors, or pilots tasked with simulating American forces in combat exercises, to perform just like their American adversaries really would, adding a great deal of value to that sort of training. Now, I'm going to quote retired Navy captain and former director of operations at the U.S. Pacific Command's Joint Intelligence Center, Carl Schuster, now. Quote, "The instructor insights add context to the remotely collected technical intelligence-based information and open source materials. You can build a very thorough and complete picture by fusing all that together." But maybe most damning of all, Brown's experience commanding units tasked with delivering nuclear weapons could provide Chinese military analysts with unique insights into how a nuclear war might play out, potentially creating opportunities to counter American strategy if such a fight ever were to occur. So, while Brown may not be all that up to speed on the latest and greatest hardware being employed by the U.S. Air Force, his deep-rooted understanding of Air Force culture and the function of American fighter pilots may be even more valuable to the large and well-funded but otherwise inexperienced Chinese Air Force. Of course, Brown isn't the only Western or even American pilot to trade their nation's secrets for a Chinese payday. In October of 2022, the UK Ministry of Defense released a report highlighting as many as 30 former Royal Air Force pilots who had been contracted to train Chinese aviators in the PLA. Now, according to that report, pilots were offered pay packages of up to $270,000 American dollars for their services. Surprisingly, the Ministry of Defense concluded at the time that doing so wasn't a violation of any current UK law, but they were nonetheless trying to deter pilots from doing it. Now, that same year, a former U.S. Marine AV-8B Harrier instructor pilot named Daniel Edmund Duggan was arrested in Australia after training Chinese naval aviators between 2010 and 2012 via a shell company called the Test Flying Academy of South Africa. Now, Duggan has continued to dispute these charges, but, well, it's worth noting that he once shared a mailing address in Beijing with a Chinese national who also paid for his transportation from Australia and scheduled Chinese fighter pilots for Duggan to train. And I'll give you 3 guesses as to who that Chinese national was, but you're only going to need one. Because, yeah, it was Su Bin. It's crazy. Now, Brown is the first Western pilot since Duggan to be charged with such a crime, but it is clear that Chinese efforts continued throughout. In June of 2024, the United States, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand all published bulletins calling out China's continued efforts to recruit former NATO aviators, just like Brown. I'll quote the American bulletin directly. The PLA is using private companies in South Africa and China to hire former fighter pilots from Canada, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Australia, the United States, and other Western nations to train PLA Air Force and Navy aviators. The PLA wants the skills and expertise of these individuals to make its own military operations more capable while gaining insight into Western air tactics, techniques, and procedures. The insight the PLA gains from Western military talent threatens the safety of the targeted recruits, their fellow service members, and the U.S. and allied security. Now, as usual, today isn't my first day on the internet, and I know by now there are some folks wondering out loud why Brown and Duggan aren't facing charges for treason rather than for violating arms export controls. So let's run down Article 3, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution very briefly, which outlines what is considered treason by U.S. law. It reads, quote, "Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court." And Title 18 of the U.S. Code 2381 echoes the Constitution while outlining possible punishments. I'll quote it now. "Whoever, owing allegiance to the United States, levies war against them or adheres to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort within the United States or elsewhere, is guilty of treason and shall suffer death or imprisoned and fined and incapable of holding any U.S. office." Now, both of these documents effectively state that there are 2 ways that someone can commit treason. The first is the most direct, levying war against the United States. So if Brown or Duggan were to have actually flown combat missions against American forces, for instance, well, that would obviously be treason. The second, however, is a bit more indirect, adhering to the enemies of the United States. Now, this could easily include things like sharing sensitive information, which there is little to no doubt that both Brown and Duggan are guilty of doing. But importantly, China is not an officially recognized enemy of the United States. China may be a geopolitical rival and a diplomatic adversary, and certainly a looming threat on the horizon, but the United States is not at war with China, and as such, there is no legal standing for treason charges. This is why, despite the term being tossed around a lot in political circles, very few people have ever been charged with treason, and even fewer have ever been convicted. In America's entire 250-year history, only 40 treason cases have ever been prosecuted. Only 13 people have ever been convicted, and only 3 have ever been executed. In fact, there's only been 1 person indicted for treason in the past 70 years, a man named Adam Gadon, who was charged with making propaganda videos for Al-Qaeda back in 2006, but he was killed in an airstrike before he could ever see a trial. But the law is, of course, subject to some degree of interpretation, and that means people like Duggan and Brown may not be protected from treason charges forever. If a war were to break out between the US and China in the near future, aggressive prosecutors could theoretically make the argument that Brown and Duggan were indeed guilty of treason, despite their actions taking place prior to a formal declaration of war. And while that argument could be an uphill battle, a ruling on their behalf could establish new legal precedent for these types of cases. But in the meantime, Brown has been charged with a willful violation of the Arms Export Control Act, or AECA, which can come with a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison or $1 million in fines. The language in the DOJ press release also says that Brown is charged with both providing and conspiring to provide defense services to the Chinese military, and that conspiring part could be interpreted in a few different ways. If it's listed as a separate charge under the federal conspiracy statute, well, it could also come with a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison and up to $250,000 in fines. But to be clear, I have no real expertise in criminal law at all, and this is just the best that I could assess based on reading through the related statutes. So take everything I just said with a healthy grain of salt, and if there are any legal experts in the audience right now, please feel free to chime in the comments. Let me know what I may have gotten wrong or add any clarity if you see fit. And of course, I want to emphasize one more time that these charges against Brown, like those against Duggan, are currently only that, charges. The phrase innocent until proven guilty doesn't actually appear anywhere in the Constitution or really anywhere in America's legal framework, but that's because it's more of a common expression used to summarize foundational principles of the American justice system, like the 5th and 14th Amendments, and was more verbosely codified in 1895 by the Supreme Court in Coffin v. the United States when it concluded that the presumption of innocence is a fundamental principle of criminal law and a part of American jurisprudence. Now, that was a wordy way of saying that these crimes are alleged to have occurred, and until Brown and Duggan have their days in court, we should be reluctant to pass our own judgment. And that is a reminder for me just as much as it's a reminder for you, because I have to admit, it is hard for me to stomach the idea of how anyone could spend years in uniform, working, toiling, struggling alongside their brothers and sisters in service just to go train potential adversaries to kill them for nothing but a paycheck. And I suppose that comes with another worthwhile reminder that even my objectivity has its limits. And with that, ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.